Who are the four great American playwrights? Miller, O'Neill, Williams, and Albee. Williams, O'Neill, Miller, and Albee. What is considered Miller's greatest work? Crucible. And what is considered Williams's greatest work? What? Streetcar Named Desire. Now, one thing I did not talk about last time, and I should have, is that both Miller and Williams were pioneers in a style called psychological realism. They were both pioneers in a style called psychological realism. Psychological realism is when a play or a novel has scenes in it that are only privy to the reader or to the audience. And so what do I mean by this? In A Streetcar Named Desire, whenever Blanche, the protagonist, talks about her past, we hear polka music. Now, no one else hears this polka music, but we actually hear it, and Blanche hears it. And the reason is it's in her head. And it's because her ex-husband, they were at a dance, and he ran out of the dance and killed himself. And so she always hears this music whenever she talks about her past, and the music always stops with a gunshot. And people always stare at her, and they're like, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" And she's like, "Oh, it's nothing." But this happens a few times in the play, and every time it happens, it's laying the groundwork for the reveal of what happened in her past. As a result, we're seeing into Blanche's mind, what's dwelling on her, what's that thing that constantly eats at her throughout the show. In Death of a Salesman, there is actually a character that the protagonist sees that no one else sees. And so you have the other characters always saying, "Well, Pop's talking to himself again. Yeah, it's getting worse and worse. Yeah, last night he was ranting until early in the morning." Now, what they don't see is he's talking to his brother. And his brother's sitting there and they're going back and forth. "Oh, yeah, I could have done this. Yeah, but how do I get this done?" And no one else sees this. And what we're actually seeing is Willie working out issues in his mind. And so that's psychological realism. It's when we actually see into the psyche, the mind of a character. But other characters cannot. We are seeing what's going on within them. The other characters are trying to figure out what's wrong with them. Williams and O'Neill were pioneers. They were really people who brought this to the forefront as far as the dramatic style. But that is psychological realism. The great play by Albee. What is that great play by Albee? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And so that leaves us O'Neill and his masterpiece, A Long Day's Journey into the Night. Long Day's Journey into the Night. Now, these were not their only great plays, of course. Miller's Crucible is usually ranked among the great American plays. Williams' The Glass Menagerie is usually ranked among the great American plays. Of those plays, all of them have Pulitzers except one, and that is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is the only one of those plays that did not receive a Pulitzer. And so, who has the most awards of those playwrights? Nope. O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill is the most awarded playwright in the history of this country. You name it, he has it on the mantle. 4 Pulitzers and a Nobel Prize in Literature. And he is the only U.S. playwright to have a Nobel Prize in Literature. Which of these playwrights testified before HUAC? Nope. Arthur Miller. Remember the Red Scare? Have you now ever been a member of the Communist Party? This is one of the reasons we don't have a lot of work by Williams. His career was basically cut right when it was hitting its full stride. He had already been to Hollywood. They were looking at making movies of his work, and none of that occurred because he would not give up names. And so Miller's career got cut a little bit short there. What is the form of theater that is mostly associated with the United States? The musical. Now remember, we did not create the musical, but we did innovate it into what it is today. How did we innovate it? What innovation did we make that made the musical what it is today? Yeah, we had all that, but I could put that in a Ziegfeld show. What did we do to the musical that made it into the show that people will pay a fortune for today? The first show that introduced this was Showboat in 1927. Narrative. We gave it a story which connected all the songs. We gave it a narrative where story was progressed in between the songs. Before, they were independent features, one after the other. Then we got a hold of it, and next minute you're actually watching a full show, not a bunch of little shows. And so the first to do this, I just said, was Showboat, 1927. It wasn't until 1943 that we made our next big stride, and that was Oklahoma. Oklahoma, as you were saying earlier, that was the one that finally put in the acting, the dance, the music. That's the one that finally came up with the chemistry where it all evened out. As landmark of a show, as Showboat was, it was also a prototype that others were trying to imitate and get right. It's really, rough around the edges compared to what a musical is today. However, when we take a look at it, it's the first one that tries to tell us a story. Then Oklahoma is the first one that tells us that complete story, combining all the elements of theater. And so Oklahoma is considered by many to be that big turning point that launches us into the modern musical. Who created Oklahoma? Rodgers and Hammerstein. Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein. They are considered the most successful duo in musical history. They put up hit after hit after hit. Now, neither of them wrote the stories. They were the most important features, though, in creating a musical, and those positions are what? The music and the lyrics. The composer and the lyricist. Those are the positions. The composer and the lyricist. The lyricist is writing the songs. The composer is writing the music. They are not writing the story. The script, the story in a musical is called what? Narrative musicals are called this. The book. A book musical. The book is the story. The book is the script. But it is not the person who is championed for the musical. Playwrights are championed for their work. The story writer for a musical gets a credit on the side. It's the lyricist and the composer that are the champions for the musical. And so Rodgers and Hammerstein are our big duo. In fact, our longest running shows are all musicals, one after another. You look at the longest running shows in U.S. history, it's a musical after a musical. They just line up one after another. This modern form of theater featured a protagonist often in search of identity. The example I gave you of this style was from an American playwright, though it is a German form. The play was The Hairy Ape. What style of theater, what genre does that fall under? The Hairy Ape. What? Expressionism. Thank you. Remember, Expressionism is a German style. And O'Neill, though he wrote an expressionistic play, he was not just an expressionist. As we talked about, he's the most awarded playwright. The man wrote in every genre you can imagine just to show he could do it more than likely. He was just constantly playing around with stuff. This also German style of theater was mainly used for political means. It was mainly used for political means, and it was a non-illusionary form of theater. A non-illusionary form of theater. One of its main proponents championed an idea that he called alienation. The belief that the audience should always know they're sitting in a show. It should not be something that they're swept away and lose track of what's going on in it. Its champion was a German Jew who had to leave Germany, of course. He was in the United States when the Red Scare exploded. He was called also before HUAC. I've given you enough information that you can look into a search engine and get the answer. And so I will leave you with that to look up later. German form of theater, alienation. Playwright was a German Jew who had to leave Germany and testify before HUAC. That will give you the form of theater and the playwright and what his great play was. Mechanical advancement equals enlightenment. Mechanical advancement equals enlightenment. Futurism. What nation was futurism really championed? Where? You had it right, I'm just asking. Italy. Futurism really got its paws in real tight in Italy. Now it had a lot of Germans who were also really big in it, especially German filmmakers, but Italy is really where this one's coming from. If I said a movement was based on chance, Dadaism. In a nutshell, it's a movement based on chance. It is a Swiss movement, though it's in France that it really becomes popular. Who was the individual mostly associated with it? Tristan Tzar. What was his Dadaist play that is often cited? The Gas Heart. What was the first of these non-realistic movements? What? Symbolism. Symbolism is the first. That's often why we refer back to it. Though it didn't have a lot of staying power, it is going to have influence on everybody else. In the visual arts, this style really exploded thanks to the work of Salvador Dali. Surrealism. Salvador Dali is mostly associated with surrealism. In the theater, an individual who really wanted to be part of this movement was Artaud. Artaud was the one who really tried to tie himself to it and create some surrealistic plays. The play that is most often cited is Jet of Blood, Squirt of Blood, Fountain of Blood. All translations come out to about the same. But Artaud, I said, and this is only opinionated, is that he is our greatest bad artist. His whole reputation rests upon his academic and theoretical writings about the theater. Those writings create what? The theater of cruelty. What was cruel about it? What made the theater of cruelty cruel? Well, that's something else for you to look up. Make sure you put a star next to it so you know you have to find it and work on it. Or you can take a look at one of our past lectures, find it, and listen to what I had to say about it then. But make sure you look up the Theater of Cruelty. What was the book by Artaud that really explained a lot of these theories? It became a hit during the Second World War, where Artaud couldn't enjoy its success. The Theater and Its Double. That is Artaud's book that explains his theories behind the theater of cruelty. Lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Who said that? Lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde. Wilde is associated with what movement? Art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. Unlike all these movements we've been naming on continental Europe, where there's this psychological agenda. Art for art's sake was simply creating art for the sake of creating it. They wanted to make things that gave people pleasure and enjoyment. They were not trying to send messages or dig deep into the human soul. They were trying to get people into seats and give them a good laugh or move them emotionally. They were not invested in trying to change things. Samuel Beckett and Ian Esko are associated with what theater? What style of theater do those two names dwell in? Théâtre d'absurde, theater of the absurd. Theater of the absurd really gets its wings in the 1950s. The first real successful play under this theater is by Ian Esko. Well, Bald Soprano is the play he is mostly known for, and you should know that one. Bald Soprano is the play he is mostly known for. And then Samuel Beckett is regarded by many people to be the finest playwright of the 20th century, and his masterwork was Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot. You know, Endgame, Happy Days, Act Without Words, all of them are extremely absurd and have great comical moments, but Waiting for Godot is the show that everybody turns to and points at and says, this is what we're doing this for. Out of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, which was the lyricist? Hammerstein. Hammerstein was the lyricist in that relationship. No Exit is an example of what type of theater? Then put a star next to it and put No Exit, so you know to look that one up. Spell it. That's the playwright. And so, Sartre, yes? Existentialism. Existentialism. Remember, the 20th century, we start moving away from realism. But realism is what these people are trying to reject. It's a foundation of what these people are looking at, saying, no, this isn't going to get it done. Existentialism. You know, remember, in existentialism, we are condemned to free will. It's free will that put those characters in hell, and it's free will that, you know, always robs them of their greatest desires. And yes, that play is by Jean-Paul Sartre. What playwright gave the foundation for the theater of the absurd? Basically saying that the human condition was absurd. Who? Nope. But Ian Esko wrote in French, and so did this individual. Camus, Albert Camus. What was his great existentialist novel? I'll throw you a bone on this one. The Stranger. The Stranger. How many Irish artists did we cover in this section? two: Oscar Wilde and Samuel Beckett. Even though Beckett wrote in French, he was from Ireland. And Ionesco, who wrote in French, was also not French. He was from Romania. And yet in the 20th century, many people regard them as the finest of the French playwrights. What city is the theater capital of the United States? Where? The United States. New York. And, what is the theater capital of Britain? London. What is the theater district in New York? Broadway. And what is the theater district in London? I heard something. West End. West End. What period in U.S. history did the United States government fund theater? The Great Depression. I thought somebody would have that one really quick. The Great Depression. What government organization funded it? The WPA, and by funding it, they created the Federal Theater Project. What does WPA stand for? Works Progress Administration. Works Progress Administration. And it created the Federal Theater Project. What was its purpose in creating the Federal Theater Project? One word can give the answer. Nope. What? Jobs. It was created to give people jobs. Just like the WPA, CCC, and all the other acronyms that it created, for construction workers, for plumbers, for all this other stuff to try, for farmers, all the stuff they created was to keep people working. And so you had thousands of artists who were unemployed during the Great Depression, and so the government stepped in and created work for them. Now, eventually, it would be accused of creating propaganda, but its founding was to give artists jobs. That was its primary focus because it's under the WPA, and the WPA, Works Progress Administration, their whole purpose was to keep people working. How long did the Federal Theater Project last? 4 years. In 4 years, it did a ton of work. It employed thousands of artists. It was highly successful by a lot of metrics. It also created a style of theater to inform the public of what was going on in the world. That style of theater we know as the living newspaper. They created shows about topical subjects, and it was the living newspaper. Now, eventually, it would be banned. Some people said that it cost too much money. No, it was such a small part of the budget, it was ridiculous. But one of the big hang-ups people had is that whoever's paying for the theater decided a lot of what was going to go on in the theater. And the government was paying for it, and so the government could direct it to perform what it wanted. And a lot of people got nervous about that. Art used for political means is what we call, here's your moment, propaganda. And so it was accused of propaganda eventually. What reforms did the WPA, Federal Theater Project, and all those other Depression-era programs fall under? The New Deal. FDR's New Deal created it. Broadway is the goal for most shows. It's the biggest theaters. You know, it charges the most money. It has the largest budgets to put on, you know, spectacles. It's ruled by musicals today, but plays still make it every now and then. They just don't get these long runs like musicals do that go for decades. But this, you know, drove up a lot of costs for working on Broadway. And so a movement began in order to produce shows that were no longer marketable on Broadway. This movement was off-Broadway. Off-Broadway, you moved into a smaller theater, you dealt with less unions, and you could also put on shows that didn't have to seat 3,000 to 4,000 people a night just to try and pay the bills. You know, you could do intimate work again. If Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams had come out today, it'd be very hard for their shows to start on Broadway. They would more than likely start off Broadway, and if they were very good, they would eventually move to Broadway. That's not always the case, though. You know, it's not like, you know, if you make it here, you'll make it there. The Boys in the Band, it opened off Broadway, and 50 years later, it opened on Broadway. And so it's not a real, you know, fast stepping stone to make one to the other. However, one of the issues that off-Broadway ran into is Broadway producers realized, hey, we can use this as a testing ground. And all of a sudden, the cost of off-Broadway started going up. And so another movement began. Off-Broadway. And off-Broadway, you were working in very small spaces. You know, sometimes they could seat 100 people. And they were a lot of found spaces. Cafe Sino was an actual cafe that put on shows. But you could do theater in them that wasn't going to cost you an arm and a leg, and you could build from there. And so off-Broadway are still highly affordable tickets to see shows in New York, where you're paying $20, $25 a ticket versus $225, $300 a ticket, depending on what show you're trying to go see. When Young Frankenstein originally opened on Broadway, its opening price for tickets were $400 a piece. And so a family of four did not go see that show. And when Hamilton, the latest, big, show that's still playing up there, when the original cast was about to step down and let others take over, the tickets were going for $1,000 a piece. And so, and that was on the secondary market because all the first line tickets were already gone. And so off-Broadway, and off-Broadway still affordable, but off-Broadway is still where you can see high quality work at a very affordable price. Now, this should not lead us to believe that all theater is in New York. Theaters outside of New York that are unionized are called regional theaters. They're also called resident theaters, LORTs. But regional theaters, in fact, one of the more successful ones is in this state, that being Alabama Shakespeare Festival. If you look at off-Broadway and off-Broadway, as you're right in the majors. The regional theaters are your AAA. There's a lot of people working in them. In Atlanta, the Actors Express and the Alliance Theater, fabulous places doing great work. But what really makes them regional theaters is the fact that they are unionized. The people who are there, that's what they do for a living. They're not working in a restaurant during the day and then rushing to the theater to work at night. Their job is at the theater. This is what they do for a living. And so that's what makes it a regional theater. In Britain, rather than regional theaters, you have a system of these subsidized theaters. National theaters. Now, the reason they're subsidized is, of course, the government puts money towards those theaters. So if they don't have a hit, it's not going to make the theater go out of business. Any show on Broadway, if an audience stops coming, that show is pulled off Broadway. Something else has to replace it. If it's not successful, people lose money. People go out of business. It's not the same thing overseas. Now, one of the questions that was I brought up was, if the government is funding a lot of these theaters, how much say does the British government have in what's being put on? To find that answer, write this down. Saved by Edward Bond. Saved by Edward Bond. That was the play that had the British government have a heart attack when they saw, oh my God, we're funding this? The fear in Britain is that they'll create a federal theater project problem. The Federal Theater Project was a great idea. It did a lot of good. But in the end, people started pulling strings, and it became dangerous. And so this is something that overseas people are very weary of. And so if you look up Saved by Edward Bond, it'll give you an answer to that question. Now, the British system, of course, when it was created with these national theaters, they were centralized, mainly in London and other highly urban areas. But people from all over the country were paying taxes for this theater to occur. And so a lot of people started complaining, hey, where's my national theater? And so we had centralization, and then over time, the National Theater decentralized, meaning it moved theaters into other areas. Today there's a National Theater in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare is from. There's national theaters in the south of England. There's national theaters in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, which are all part of the British Empire. Today you can go to a lot of places that are national theaters. Now, Britain's funding theater. Do we have any funding for the arts in the United States? That's why I said arts and not theater. We do have funding in the United States. It is highly limited. Highly limited. Remember, that funding falls under the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA. The NEA is not strictly for theater. The NEA funds tons of projects for any U.S. artist. It's very difficult for an individual artist to get funding. For that, you can look at thank the work of Robert Mapplethorpe. But a lot of companies and organizations still receive funding through the National Endowment for the Arts. Approximately how much do each of you pay every year for the National Endowment to exist? Each person in here pays about 47 cents a year. So that's how much we throw into arts funding. The National Theatre of London gets about $93 million a year, just for that one theater to operate. And so it's a huge slush fund, but it's also considered, the pride of London. It's a huge endeavor. And so we pay about 47 cents per year. I pointed out last time that, all of you at one point have seen something sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts, especially when you were younger. One of the big recipients was PBS, and PBS is the, public broadcasting system that produces Sesame Street, Blue's Clues, Author, Dora the Explorer. All that has had funding through the National Endowment for the Arts. And so the NEA is not strictly for theater. It has to fund everything that our government's going to have in the arts. And it's constantly under, fights of people saying, Big Bird has been on public assistance long enough. He should make it on his own. And you see all these cartoons that come out showing Big Bird saying, I don't want to live next to Oscar. You got to help me. And so, keep Cookie Monster with cookies. And even though they have a meat salad a lot today also. And so that's where our National Endowment is, and that funds it. Now, the National Endowment for the Arts can pull funding if they feel the artist's work does not represent the American people or the desires of the American people. And so, since it's being paid for with tax dollars, the people over it can look at it and say, well, this isn't really what we want to represent us. All right, guys, listen up. No review is all-inclusive. If I left you with questions saying put a star next to it and look it up, please do. Odds are that, that question is going to find its way to you. With that, remember, we do not actually come here on Thursday. I will have the test posted. It'll open at class time. It will close by the end of the day. Remember, it is timed, and so when you go in there, start working quick on it. There's a lot of information. As I did say, no review is all conclusive. Anything that was covered through Crash Course or through one of the lectures, it's also eligible. Though, if you're just looking to pass, there's enough information given in the review to get you through it. And so you won't have to sweat that one.